Dragon Ball has plenty of iconic villains. Frieza, Majin Buu, Zamasu, but only one of them truly felt like something out of a horror movie. And I'm talking about Cell. More specifically, Imperfect Cell. His later forms might be stronger, but his first appearance was a nightmare. Grotesque, unsettling, and genuinely terrifying. And today, we're going deep into why Imperfect Cell, specifically, was so terrifying to us as kids. From his design, to the way he fed, to the psychological fear he brought not just into the world, but to the Z Fighters themselves. And by the end of this video, you may just agree with me that no villain in Dragon Ball Z has ever matched the pure terror of Imperfect Cell. When Cell was introduced, the tone of Dragon Ball Z shifted dramatically. Up until then, villains were big, loud, and they were definitely flashy. But Imperfect Cell was introduced like a creature feature. Entire towns went missing, bodies vanished without a trace, and all that remained were piles of clothes. And what made this so unsettling was how quiet it all was. Dragon Ball villains usually announced themselves with explosions, armies, or planet-wide broadcasts. Imperfect Cell did the opposite. He crept in silently, leaving behind nothing but empty towns. Think about that imagery. Entire neighborhoods, schools, cities, all reduced to ghost towns overnight. No screaming armies, no heroic clashes, pure silence, broken only by the sound of the clothes of his victims hitting the floor. It's the kind of horror you'd expect in a post-apocalyptic film, not Dragon Ball Z. And the genius here is how it played with the audience's expectations. We'd just come off arcs with Saiyans and Frieza, where the danger was all about overwhelming strength. So when the Android Saga introduced this thing that wasn't making headlines with power levels, but with mystery and dread, it completely shifted the energy of the show. Every new scene felt like a horror setup. The camera angles lingered longer, the music dropped into eerie tones. Even the Z Fighters seemed unsure of what they were dealing with. And as viewers, we felt the exact same creeping tension that they did. We didn't know what he looked like. We didn't know just how he killed. We only knew that something monstrous was out there, hunting. And that's what made his first phase so terrifying. This buildup was genius, and we didn't see him at first. Instead, we saw the effects of his presence. Drained cities, hushed whispers, and Piccolo's horrified reaction when he finally learned the truth. That kind of suspense isn't common in shonen anime, and it immediately set Cell's appearance apart. Imperfect Cell himself looks wrong, and that's why he works. His design is alien, but not sleek like Frieza. Instead, it's insectoid. Bulging eyes, slimy skin, and a long, grotesque tail. He moves awkwardly, almost animalistic, crouching and hissing instead of standing like a warrior. Toriyama created a villain that wasn't meant to be admired. Instead, feared. The way Cell's tail twitches like a scorpion stinger, or how his face never quite settles into a human-like expression. It's uncanny. Semi-Perfect and Perfect Cell look way cleaner, but Imperfect Cell's design embodies the word predator. Of course, the most horrifying detail wasn't his look, it was the way that he killed. Cell didn't just destroy people, he consumed them. That tail wasn't just for show. It absorbed victims completely, sucking them dry until they were gone forever. And unlike Frieza or Vegeta, most of his victims weren't fighters. They were innocent civilians, defenseless against something they couldn't even see coming. Imagine living in a city, and then suddenly, everyone around you is screaming as they vanish inside of a monster's body. It wasn't just death, it was erasure. And that's what made him feel so much darker compared to the villains of the past. Every person absorbed was fueling his growth, like he was building himself from the corpses of the innocent. What really sold the fear to me is how the Z Fighters reacted. Piccolo, who stared down Frieza's army and fought Saiyans stronger than him, looked disturbed after encountering Cell. Trunks and Krillin didn't fight him head on. Instead, they tracked him like prey, sneaking around to prevent him from evolving further. This wasn't just another brawl, it was a survival story. Even our heroes acted differently, because Imperfect Cell wasn't about honor, power, or eternal youth. He was about the hunt. And for the first time in Dragon Ball, the Z Fighters weren't the hunters, they were the hunted. Part of what makes Imperfect Cell so effective is that his introduction borrows heavily from horror movie DNA. His insectoid features feel inspired by The Fly. His stealth and his stalking mirror the Alien franchise. Even his absorption process feels like something you'd see in a body horror film. And Toriyama, whether intentionally or not, created a villain that preys upon primal fear. The fear of parasites, the fear of predators, or the fear of losing your individuality. That horror element is something Dragon Ball rarely, if ever, touches. And it's why this stands out so much even decades later. Now, don't get me wrong, Semi-Perfect and Perfect Cell are incredible. Perfect Cell gave us the Cell games, one of Dragon Ball's best arcs to date. But when Cell evolved after absorbing the androids, that horror element started to fade. He became a calculating villain, almost regal, obsessed with proving himself in combat, just like basically all the villains who came prior. And in Perfect Cell, he wasn't about combat. He was about survival, consumption, and most importantly, fear. By the time he reached Perfect Cell, he was still dangerous, but he wasn't scary. That uniqueness makes Imperfect Cell's era one of the biggest tonal shifts in Dragon Ball and shonen history. So why does this matter? Because Imperfect Cell gave Dragon Ball something it rarely had: horror. It reminded us, the viewers, sometimes it's about survival against something that sees you as nothing more than food. And that horror stage that Cell had gave weight to the Cell games. Because without it, Perfect Cell may have not have seemed quite as dangerous. We, the viewers, need to see him as a monster before we can respect him as a rival. Imperfect Cell wasn't just a villain, he was a nightmare. And he alone proved that sometimes the scariest thing isn't just raw power, but the idea that you could be hunted, absorbed, and erased without a trace. Think about it. Frieza represented tyranny, Boo represented absolute chaos, but in Perfect Cell, he represented something far more personal. The fear that you, as an individual, could be absorbed into the body of a monster and become nothing more than fuel. That's not just Dragon Ball storytelling, that's horror at its core. And what's fascinating to me is how short-lived that phase was. Toriyama could have kept Imperfect Cell around for way longer, and we would have had a full-blown horror-based arc inside of Dragon Ball. Think about how cool that would have been. Instead, he evolved, literally, into something a lot more cleaner, refined, and eventually, I guess, a bit more honorable. But that brief window where Imperfect Cell was roaming around the Earth, well, it felt like after hundreds upon hundreds of episodes, we were finally watching Dragon Ball take a detour into a completely different genre. Now, of course, that being said, it does play on the sci-fi elements that represent Z as a whole, but still, it was vastly different than anything that came before. And maybe that's the real legacy of Imperfect Cell, proving that in a world with Super Saiyans and Ki Blasts, sometimes the greatest danger isn't a fierce nemesis or warrior, it's a monster lurking in the shadows. So you tell me, was Imperfect Cell the scariest villain in all of Dragon Ball? I mean, who even comes close? But if you do think a different villain takes that crown, let me know in the comments below. And as always, make sure you drop a like if you did enjoy the video so I know to post more content like this. Also subscribe, we're on the road to 3,000 subscribers. And as always, I love you guys. I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.
Very well. Since you're literally dying to know, I suppose there's no harm in telling you. My name is Cell. I am an android.
You're an android?
I am the single greatest achievement of my creator, Dr. Shiro.
As I should have known.